Hi there. Welcome to Chapter 14, Ethics of Mass Media, which is a lot about the First Amendment, privacy, ethics, and a whole ton of other related issues. Here's the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The First Amendment covers a lot of ground, which is what the framers of the Constitution and those who wrote and enacted the amendment wanted to do. We're going to set aside the discussion of establishing of religion or prohibiting free exercise of religion. We're not going to talk about the right of people to assemble peaceably. We're not going to deal with petitioning the government for answers to their grievances. We're concerned mostly in this chapter about abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The speech being, at the time, conceived as people who would make public speeches or print speeches in publications, and the press, the actual form of the media that was prevalent at that time, that disseminate those kinds of information. So it's helpful to have an establishment to establish the First Amendment before we proceed. So be sure you know this. Now, to simplify some things, first of all, that's a nice little woodcut graphic from way back. It says the tyrant's foe, the people's friend, and then a picture of an old type of pressure press that was used in those days. And I believe that came from a flag of a newspaper, maybe in Baltimore. The point was, if you are a tyrant, and largely they meant that as government or certain businesses, then newspapers in particular at that time were going to become your friend. They were going to fight back. They were going to stand up for the people who could be oppressed by those other forms. So, in general, the First Amendment guarantees freedom of expression and freedom of the press. It doesn't mean that you can get away with anything. You still have consequences if you publish material that's libelous or slanderous. You still may, if you've not reported things truthfully, you still may be held to court action for that. But on the other hand, you won't. Nobody's going to send you to jail, presumably, for printing what you want to print. So those two are important in upholding democratic principles. Democratic is lowercase here. It doesn't mean the Democrat Party. It just means the principles of democracy that the country was founded under and most people believe still exists under. So the purpose of freedom of the press and freedom of expression is to allow the media to keep citizens informed. We'll go a little deeper into that. So, I've got a slide there of a recent, or fairly recent, photograph of a CNN presentation in which President Trump earlier this year called news outlets enemies of the people, which does raise the question, should the First Amendment always be allowed? Should freedom of the press always be there? There are much greater restrictions in England and other European and non-European countries. The press there does not have a right to necessarily print everything they want, or there are stricter penalties if they print something that is unpopular. People are raising the issue now about whether there should be government censorship. Should the government have a role, which it traditionally has not, in deciding what is printed or aired and what is not? Who's going to be that? Who's going to fulfill that function? Is it going to continue to be traditional media that act as gatekeepers for that information? Is it going to be non-traditional media, social media, blogs, and other things in which they are not in the past considered mainstream gatekeepers, but now rapidly become that because it's possible for anybody to put what they want out there? Should certain tabloids or other sensational journalism be punished more than regular newspapers or magazines. In other words, there's only certain aspects of journalism in which there should be censorship. How is the press being managed under the current presidency? Well, Donald Trump would certainly like, and people that are part of his cabinet would certainly like to see the press reined in and controlled. There have been attempts, many attempts to do that in terms of, battling the media at press conferences, refusing access to certain journalists, banning certain journalists from receiving interviews or access. And as the picture shows, basically trying to get across the point that news outlets, some news outlets anyway, are enemies of the people. Quite a bold statement to take, a bold plan to take. Most journalists are now back on the defensive. They consider themselves champions of the truth, and we'll talk a little bit later about what the truth is. So these are some issues that people are debating right now, and most traditional journalists believe in no government censorship and the ability of the press to operate freely. But the same types of people that got President Trump elected can tend to agree with him on some of these issues, that the government should have the right to clamp down on media. Nice little cartoon here. This was from back in 2005, but it shows the castle of the mainstream media. And there's people out there, it's ironic, saying, bloggers again, what do they want this time? The usual. And facts and objectivity. So this kind of illustrates, even though this is more than 10 years old, that back in that frame of time, the public wanted mainstream journalists to deal more with facts and objectivity and truth, which is the number one thing, than they were. And this is a refrain that President Trump and his administration has picked up. Who are the conveyors of truth? What are the facts? Is it what one person says, or is it what another person says? You've heard the term fake news. That's a derogatory term that some people use against people that put out facts that aren't supported by reality in many cases. But it does beg the question of do we use what the media interprets to be the facts, or do we use what a president interprets to be the facts, and or even among us individuals on social media, how do we decide what the facts are? Because the facts lead you to the truth, which is the ultimate goal of journalists. So who are today's gatekeepers? Well, they're bloggers, they're people on social media, they're mainstream press, they're alternative press, they're corporations, they're government entities, schools. Lots of people now want to be gatekeeping the information they release, deciding what facts they want to present to the public. Some other issues that are raised by the First Amendment these days are, what expectations do we have of a right of privacy, including internet surveillance? We talked quite a bit about this in another presentation, but we know now that on social media it's possible and very likely for whoever might be trolling your account, whether it's a business looking for information on what you bought or sold, whether it's an employer looking for where you are going, what websites you're visiting, even keystrokes you're making on your computer. It's all possible, very, very likely that that's occurring to most of us at this point. What expectations do we have to right for privacy in a day and age when we can't stay off of social media, we can't be offline, we can't do certain things because our lives and our work and our jobs are so tangled up in doing those sorts of things. For example, the Wichita State University, if you use a computer tied into their system, for example, and accessing this Blackboard class or using one of their other things, they not only can keep track of where you have been, even if you're using a laptop computer, they also can actually look at keystrokes. They can watch you as you type if they choose. That information is stored Basically, anything you create, not just in social media, but on a computer these days, is being watched by corporations, businesses, and other people that would like to win your advertising dollars. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. I know a lot of people who, like me, have put a piece of dark paper over the camera on the front of their computer because there's technology that exists that people can actually watch you through that camera lens. I'm not being paranoid here. This has been proven to be true. There's even some evidence that as I'm recording this audio for the PowerPoint that that's being captured somewhere. Now, would WSU or some government agency use this against us? I don't know. Maybe if there were a court case, disagreement or something like that, they might. And I talked about how would you think about social media? How does it fit in terms of opinions and privacy? If you, again, if you post a lot of Facebook or social media or Instagram or whatever, Twitters, how much of that is protected privately and how much of that is not? The short answer is very little of it is protected. Once it's out there, it's out there. So a lot of people can and will in the future do more of getting into your private information. And we're going to talk more about journalism ethics and how they're changing or whether they're changing in a few minutes. The chapter talks about stereotypes, and I found a definition that works pretty well. It's a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Now, sometimes stereotypes actually have advantages. For example, if you're trying to think of a stereotypical statement like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, there's truth in that healthy food can help prevent you from having to see the doctor for certain health issues. And it's a cliche and a stereotype, but the fact that you can say that as a cliche or a stereotype means that without having to explain further, the person hearing that can actually understand instantly what you mean by that phrase. So at a time that the U.S. population is increasingly more and more diverse, the mainstream media still falls back on stereotypes, particularly in entertainment. This is something that is not new to you, I know. Stereotypes are considered two-dimensional representations of people, not more complex three-dimensional representations of people. And basically all groups you might think of are stereotyped. Various races, ethnicities, people of different religions, people with different skin colors, people from different cultures, people of different sexes and genders, people based on their income, whether or not they have military service, lots of other things like that. The white male perspective is still perceived and probably is still the dominant image that people have of the U.S. population, even though increasingly, like I said, the U.S. population is getting more and more diverse. White males are also stereotyped. If you look at television, for example, and movies, they're often portrayed as kind of dumb, do things when the wife or girlfriend tells them what to do, aren't particularly bright, like I said, and can be counted on to make mistakes and fail. Just as there are bad stereotypes for many of these other groups that I mentioned. So everyone kind of suffers. When I taught this class in person, I often would stand on the stage before a group of 100 or 150 people, and I would say, describe me. And we would be talking about stereotypes, and of course nobody wanted to say anything right away. So finally somebody would say, well, you're a professor. Okay. Well, you're a white guy. Right. Okay. Now let's go deeper here. Well, you dress kind of casually. Right. What do you want to say? What do you want to say? What do you want to say? And finally somebody would say, well, you're a little bit overweight. and they were trying to be kind, and I would say, no, I'm fat, I'm obese, I'm way over the amount of time I should weigh. A lot of people would say, well, you're obviously a Democrat because most professors are Democrats. I say, no, I'm not. So people have this, you can't judge a book by the cover thing, that people perceive people certain ways. And stereotypes, when they're presented in advertising and movies and in print reporting and broadcasting and public relations, generally are not a good thing, because you're basically judging or representing someone from a very two-dimensional, what do you look like on the surface kind of way. So this is why groups, including the ones I mentioned above and others, are seeing the need to fight for their identities to be treated fairly. Now, whether or not you think that is good or bad is up to you. Whether you agree with people that come out and want to discuss issues facing women or various races, people who have been, in their views, underrepresented, not empowered, held at a disadvantage, partially because of stereotypes and other situations. You may think that that's a great thing. You may think that's not such a great thing. But that's why we're seeing in the last few years this huge uptick in groups wanting to fight for their identities to be treated fairly. It's either it's women marching on Washington. It's men marching to try to get other men to be better fathers and husbands and brothers. It's various people from all races and styles. Syrians fighting to be admitted to the country, other people fighting deportation. This is why it seems like a very controversial time right now in our society, but it's partly because people are standing up, not just to stereotypes, but to other misrepresentations, and they want to be treated more fairly. Okay, the chapter also talks about sex cells, and I could have had some even more lurid photographs to put here, but I tried to keep it within reason. The first one is of two gay men showering, and I believe it was for a body wash ad or something like that. I've forgotten where I got that image. The second one is from a very controversial Carl's Jr. series of ads. They finally sort of have replaced these. It also, obviously shows her body, and parts of it are barely covered. And she's got kind of that wind-tossed hair. She's holding this huge hamburger. And the message is directly tied into a sexual message. They'll tell you size doesn't matter. She's lying. What they mean is the burger, but they also mean sex. And the catchphrase after the Carl's Jr.'s logo, it's going to get messy. So a number of TV commercials were aired on that. A number of print ads were aired. And so I just used these two quick things as examples of why in the media sex sells. It's important to understand, first of all, that this is called sexual objectification, treating people as objects, not as people. So some of you, again, may be thinking there's nothing wrong with this. Some of you may be thinking, yes, I have a real problem with using sex to sell things, particularly to impressionable children or adults. Primarily, the sex sells slogan is used in building advertisements, branding, and marketing, but it's also present, as you know, in movies, music, and magazines. Sex in publications as an attempt to sell more product and to sell more people into purchasing the product, the movie or the book or the whatever, is almost always portrayed unrealistically. How many people, I'm going to use women as an example because they're easier to find examples of, how many people really look the way some of these women are portrayed in sexually based ads. Children are particularly vulnerable to these kind of uncharacteristic, unrealistic expectations. In general, this is sort of a general statement, sexual content is more common in Europe than America, and was more widely accepted for a number of years and America still is a little behind. It's still considered a little prudish by most Europeans when it comes to ads and things like that. There's a lot of sexual innuendo, wordplay, and more graphic images in other newspapers, particularly in London and Britain and Australia and some other places like that. Just briefly, the only factoid I wanted to mention, the chapter talks about the Hays Code, which came out in 1934. Very restrictive thing that government code that really tried to get a handle and knock down attempts to use sex and lurid portrayals of people to help sell things. As the 1960s came along, it was phased out because there was a higher degree of comfortability among adults with the content, particularly the sexual content of some ads, movies, things like that. So that was replaced. This is primarily for movies by the motion picture something of America ratings in the 1960s. But since then, I mean, that gave some more slightly realistic associations with sexually based advertising, especially in movies or in content of movies. But since then, the sexual content in films has really increased. And, I'm not trying to sound like the old fogey, but stuff that passes for even G-rated movies nowadays would have been never seen by me as a child. It's considered too violent or sexist or obscene or just anxiety-ridden. I call this the death and life of newspapers, not the life and death of newspapers, because newspapers are in big trouble. I'm using newspapers as a primary example of journalists. These same problems affect broadcasters and lots of other representations of the media. I will say that I do draw a line between the term media, which can include lots of entertainment, and journalism, which can be entertaining, but it's primarily based on good reporting of factual, truthful information. So what's changed in newspapers is obviously the delivery of news has to be instantaneous these days. You no longer can wait 24 hours to publish a new paper. Newspapers have tried to fight back by acting more like the way wire services are, updating their website as many as 20 or 50 times a day, putting out special releases on social media about events. But obviously, when you're trying to rush things and you're trying to compete with broadcasts and social media, neither of which can be as often as accurate, accuracy of news accounts and newspapers can really suffer in the rush to be first and to get better ratings or give better ratings. Media revenues have been hurt by a decline in advertising. That's been going on now for a good 10 years. Newspapers can't get as many print ads, primarily because of the economic downturn of America. And online advertising just has not caught on in the news business. They don't sell many ads. They don't pay the same as print ads used to, and so that's a problem. Print media readers, especially newspapers, are getting older and dying off. And a sub-point to that is that newspapers are cutting the staff. They're cutting payroll because that's usually the largest expense in any business, so they don't go out of business. Now, for example, you might know that this year the Eagle is moving into a new building in Old Town because they don't need the huge building at 825 East Douglas anymore. It's an older building built in the 50s, 60s, and not wired for the 21st century in terms of electricity, in terms of internet, things like that. The Eagle moved its presses, or is using the presses in Kansas City to print the publication, which has meant some slight delays in content and receiving the latest content for readers, particularly in sports. So they're consolidating and downsizing. The paper is still in Wichita, but because they have a staff of maybe 1/3 what they used to have when I worked there, And a lot of it can be done digitally. It's not done with huge mechanical layouts and analog forms of communication. They can do it in a much smaller space. Another thing about newspapers is they're consolidating resources, such as the printing in their offices. Well, actually, that's what I just talked about. It's cheaper for the Eagle to print in Kansas City, to send the pages there electronically, digitally, have them printed and have them trucked out to wherever they need to be trucked out in the state, and to downsize their office than it is to, and in addition to payroll, than it is to do anything else. However, there's still a greater need than ever for quality investigative and local journalism. If you want proof of that, go to watch the winners of the Pulitzer Prizes. Go to Pulitzer.com and look at some of the investigative reporting, some of the good hard news reporting that's still being done, even by smaller newspapers, and the photojournalism that's being done even by smaller newspapers and editorial writing. And you'll see that there's a greater need than ever to keep telling the truth, keep holding people to the fire, and to investigate things. Got a couple slides called Social Responsibility of News Media. A definition of its use in the text from the Committee of Concerned Journalists is, news media is necessary, quote, to provide citizens with accurate and reliable information they need to function in a free society, end quote. It's a pretty good definition of what news media are supposed to do. And breaking that down quite a bit, they have an obligation, journalists do, to present news stories that inform and serve the needs of citizens. And to do that well, they need to have content that's accurate, presents issues in the proper context or background, why something's being done now as opposed to later, the history of an issue. And on editorial pages, to engage in criticism and analysis and to foster debate, sometimes through other things like town forums. Newspapers, news media have an obligation to present issues fairly. The balance of many viewpoints. TV stations sometimes say, we got two sources for our news. A lot of print journalists laugh at that because a lot of stories in print have multiple sources, multiple viewpoints. And the idea is to present as much information as you can and then let the reader decide what to make of it, what point of view they want. As far as presenting issues fairly, that also includes not engaging in sensationalism. We know it happens, particularly at tabloid publications, and not showing any favoritism. Journalists are often offered freebies or bribes to cover an issue a certain way, and ethical journalists don't do that. They turn those down, they ignore them. Sometimes they even report on that if the offer is of any value. News media have to present complex stories. So that means avoiding oversimplification. Sometimes there's a tendency to want to dumb it down for the public so that everybody understands it. And to an extent, that has to be true. But complex issues need complex explanations. They need investigation. They need news media is obligated to explain issues to people in a way they can understand. Another point is to present diverse perspectives. In other words, to represent the underrepresented. Stand up for the little guy. Stand up for the people who are too poor or don't have a position of power or can't get their voices heard, particularly in government, and represent them. Stand up for them. Fight for them. So this is true both inside the newsroom, where most newsrooms are not particularly diverse, among sources, people that newspaper reporters and editors use to gather information, and from the public itself. Make sure you're writing for a diverse audience. This diversity stuff is something that most newspapers and TV stations, sadly, don't do enough. Sometimes it's genuinely for a lack of resources. Sometimes there's arguments made that the pool of journalists from various racial and ethnic and sex backgrounds is not out there. I consider that an excuse. Newspapers should hire more diverse people, and they sure provide more diverse perspectives. Second slide on this is that news media has an obligation to monitor governments and corporations, to serve as a watchdog over government and businesses. The media, particularly the journalists, are often considered the fourth estate. You've heard of the other three states being the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. Often journalists and people actually in government consider journalists the fourth estate, the one branch that looks over, oversees, keeps an eye on, and investigates the other three branches. So this is why you see the media going after legislative issues, court issues, and then at various levels, whether it's the president or whether it's the governor of a state or a mayor of a city, the executive branches of government. Some more about characteristics of reliable journalism. There are more than 400 journalistic codes of ethics. They, many cases are very similar. They all have ethical policies that cover most of the same things. They differentiate in how they're worded, but that's just offered up as proof that journalists do try to be ethical. They do have rules they can fall back on to practice good ethical journalism. The top mandate of reliable journalism is to tell the truth through accurate reporting. It's also the basis of making sure you're not going to lose a libel lawsuit or a defamation lawsuit. There's a broad umbrella of defamation, and under that is libel and slander. In general, libel is printed defamation. In general, slander is spoken or broadcast defamation, although there are exceptions to the rule. So the best possible defense for a libel lawsuit is that the article or the broadcast or the magazine story is the truth. So again, it's getting a little bit messy these days to decide what the truth is, but most journalists can rely on actual legal documents, proofs, confessions, things like that as evidence and information from reliable sources like government officials to make sure that their articles are truthful. But again, what is the truth today? One person's facts aren't another's, and this is where we get into fake news. You know, your version of the facts is fake news. No, your version of the facts is fake news. No. You're all about the fake news. And it's hard in these finger-pointing times to actually ascertain the truth sometimes. One thing journalists have to do is balance the need to tell an important story with concerns about privacy. Journalists often struggle with this issue of, I'm going to report a story that is going to cause somebody to be embarrassed or cause their political downfall or send them to prison. I've done all three of those things in my course of my reporting and editing careers. And with their right to privacy. And it seems like a lot of college students seem to think that when it comes to somebody practicing malfeasance or doing something bad, even if they're stealing money from a company or the government, that they should be given a lot of slack and that should not be reported. Most traditional journalists say if it affects the public, then it should be reported. And the person that made those poor decisions to break the law or do something illegal are going to have to pay the consequences anyway. So the media is just going to report that. So journalists often ask the question, what is the greatest common good? Of all the things we talked about, especially this last thing about, do you tell a story and write an embarrassing story about somebody if you can prove that they have done something illegal and let it ruin their life or not? What is going to be the greatest common good? And for most journalists, the common good is for the general public. It's not for that particular politician or that particular teacher or whoever. And that is why you see so much journalism that some people claim is unfair or sensational. In their minds, they're doing the job they were setting out to do. Quick thing on plagiarism. I think you've all been inundated with information about plagiarism through various classes and descriptions and things like this. I just want to stress this because a lot of you are going to be going on and taking a lot more college classes, And this is something you really need to be aware of, because more and more academia and professors are really honing on this as a serious issue. The main takeaway here is if you cite the copyrighted work, even if you don't obtain permission to reproduce that information. In other words, if you put it in quote marks and attribute the information to a specific person and where and when it was said, you're obviously in most cases going to be okay, unless the author expressly has forbidden being passages in a book or article being reproduced. So often what teachers get is stuff that's obviously plagiarized. Somebody's been lifted from another source and planted directly into an assignment. It's pretty easy for experienced teachers to spot that, and there are it's become easy to copy and paste information from other online files. My advice is just don't do that. Check with the teacher, and if they're okay with you actually citing a source, naming it, putting quote marks around quoted material, I think most professors are okay with that. Go to the trouble to do that. You won't be seen as weak. Trust me. You won't be seen as, they wrote an impressive story here, but who knows how much of it is truth. By quoting your sources or citing your information, you're actually showing professors that you care enough about following plagiarism law to do the right thing. And I am always much more impressed with a student who doesn't try to pass off somebody else's words as their words, doesn't try to fabricate information. And there are obviously programs out there that teachers use to ferret out those passages. I have my own techniques. They're not particularly hard to use. There may have been instances in some of the blog entries, for example, this semester where people plagiarized. But the truth of the matter is that it will only bring you into a world of hurt. And I'm sure that quite a few of you know, and if you don't, that there are so-called paper mills that are sometimes free, sometimes they're very inexpensive, in which you can go online and you can either get for free or purchase for just a small amount of money papers written on particular topics. And sometimes the students will take those papers, put their name on them, rewrite them a little bit, and pass them off their own work. I am going to implore you, not only for this class, but for future classes you take in communication or anywhere, that make sure you cite content that is not your own work, and in whatever format a teacher might want, whether it's in the body of a story like journalists do, whether it's as footnotes or in a bibliography or reference page at the end. Please, please, please give that information a source. I mean, think about it, and this is why musicians get all upset when people illegally download their songs and albums, is because they're stealing. I mean, you're stealing, if you do that, essentially copyrighted information. It's a different sort of concept than plagiarism, and a lot of people seem to think that that's okay to steal free music. It's not. It is illegal, and in my view, it's also immoral and unethical. So please don't use paper mills. Please don't copy and paste without attribution or sources, and you will end up with a much happier career at college. People who don't follow those rules and get caught, and every semester I catch at least one person, there are very serious academic repercussions for those people, sometimes to the point where they are no longer allowed to continue in college. Well, on that cheery note, I'll leave you with this quote from Thomas Jefferson, a great advocate for freedom of the press. Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. And his point obviously is, if you allow people to censor the press, you will lose freedom of the press, and other people will decide for you what information should be distributed and in what form and what it should say. Thanks a lot, folks.